What's up, news? This is the Russian dude. 3 years ago, Russia watched something that was supposed to be impossible. Yevgeny Prigozhin and the Wagner group turned their frustration with Moscow into an open march, first into Rostov-on-Don and then towards the Russian capital itself. And even though that rebellion collapsed even before could be reaching Moscow, the reason behind it never disappeared. Because Prigozhin was not complaining about some vague political disagreement, he was complaining about shortages. You remember the famous "Where's the ammo?" Broken logistics, military incompetence, and a Russian state that could send people into war, but could not properly supply them. And now, 3 years later, something much bigger may be starting once again. Except this time, it is not Wagner fighters moving across Russian roads. It is just ordinary Russian civilians trying to leave Crimea before the peninsula becomes too difficult to live in, too expensive to supply, and too embarrassing for the Kremlin propaganda to explain. Crimea has always been treated by Moscow as the ultimate trophy, the symbol of Russian victory, the place that was supposed to prove Vladimir Putin could take territory from Ukraine and just keep it forever with no consequences. But now that very same peninsula is turning into a logistical trap, where fuel is disappearing, food supplies are tightening, electricity is unstable, drinking water becoming a concern, and the main connection to Russia, the Kerch Strait Bridge, more commonly known as the Crimean Bridge, is starting to look less like a symbol of strength and more like the last visible exit, which it honestly is. Right now, civilian cars are reportedly lining up near the Kerch Strait Bridge, waiting around 3 hours just to be inspected before crossing out of Crimea. And the most important detail is that the line leaving the peninsula is around 3 times longer than the line entering it, which tells you the public mood is already shifting before the full shortage crisis has even arrived. And while these civilians wait near the bridge, they can see Russian facilities burning close to the crossing, smoke drifting near the bridge itself, and a visual impression so dramatic that from above it can look as if the entire bridge area is already under pressure, even while the bridge itself is still supposedly standing. That is why this moment matters so much, because Ukraine does not necessarily need to strike the Kerch Strait Bridge today in order to change the psychology around Crimea. The message has already been delivered. And if Russian air defense cannot reliably protect valuable targets besides the bridge, then Russian civilians and Russian officials have to ask whether Moscow can really protect the bridge itself when Ukraine decides that the time is right. And by the way, today's video, it is more important than ever not to rush into conclusions too soon. That is why whenever I was preparing for it, I had to be extremely careful about which articles to choose. For example, take this story about Ukraine striking a railway bridge connected to Crimea. One headline says, "Ukraine destroys strategic railway bridge in Crimea." Simple as that. That is a straightforward description of the event itself. A bridge was hit, the focus on infrastructure, logistics, and the immediate military significance of the strike. That's it. But then you scroll down a little bit and see another headline covering the very same story. "Putin now faces the ultimate Ukrainian crisis. He could lose Crimea." Now we are in a completely different place emotionally, right? The bridge is not really the story anymore. Instead, the headline jumps several steps ahead and focuses on a much bigger conclusion, which is the possibility of Russia eventually losing Crimea. The reader goes from thinking about a damaged railway bridge to thinking about the future of the entire peninsula. Literally, same event, same day, but one headline is focused on what happened, facts. The other is forcing the reader to assume what might happen next. This is exactly why I use ground news. Ground news lets you compare headlines from dozens of outlets covering the same story, so you can instantly see how different publications frame the news. Some focus on hard facts, others focus on predictions, implications, or even worst-case scenarios. Some steer curiosity, some just steer emotions. Ground news also shows you how many sources are covering a story and where those outlets sit across the political spectrum, helping you understand not only the event itself, but the different narratives being built around it. Because sometimes the biggest difference in coverage is not the facts, it is the conclusion that the headline wants you to reach before you have even read the article. For this reason, ground news even summarizes what each side of the media, left, center or right, focuses on. So almost instantly you can tell who wants to tell you the news and who wants just to emotionally manipulate you to open the link. So guys, if you want 40% off the Vantage plan, please scan this QR code or go to ground.news/RussianYouth and please subscribe. Helps the channel tremendously. Don't just see the story, see how the story is being framed. Thanks so much Ground News for sponsoring this video. Now back to the program. Here's where it gets interesting, because the Kerch Strait Bridge is not only infrastructure, it is the physical version of Putin's entire Crimea story. Since Moscow built it to say that Crimea was permanently connected to Russia, permanently protected by Russia, and permanently removed from Ukraine's reach. That is exactly why Ukraine does not even have to disable it immediately for the bridge to become a strategic problem for Russia. Because the moment people themselves start treating the bridge as a temporary and pretty much at this point the only exit instead of a permanent connection, the political meaning of the bridge begins to reverse. For years, Russian propaganda presented this crossing as proof that Crimea was safe, integrated and untouchable. But now Ukrainian pressure around the bridge is creating the completely opposite impression. Because every fire nearby, every long line of civilian cars and every warning from Ukrainian officials makes the bridge feel less like a guarantee and more like a timer. Ukraine also appears to have obtained close-up images of the Kerch Strait Bridge from several different angles. And that matters because it suggests Ukraine can observe the bridge closely enough to understand its vulnerabilities, defenses and surroundings, which is already a psychological operation before we even talk about what could happen later. This does not automatically mean Ukraine is about to bring the bridge down tomorrow, because there are reasons Kyiv might wait, especially if the bridge is still useful as an exit route for civilians leaving Crimea. But it does mean that the threat is credible enough to change the behavior. That is why the warnings from Ukrainian voices are so important, because the leader of the Crimean Tatars has openly told people to leave Crimea while they still can, while Ukraine's defense leadership has suggested that Crimea will soon become an island, which is a careful way of just saying something enormous without spelling out every single detail, which, well, all the people, they already know what it really means. And the message is no longer subtle either. The peninsula is being isolated. The exits may not remain comfortable forever, and anyone who moved into occupied Ukrainian territory under Russian protection should understand that Moscow promises are not the same thing as real safety. This is where people often misunderstand Ukraine's strategy, because they imagine the only way to change Crimea's future is a dramatic landing operation or some kind of a movie-style assault. But Ukraine has spent years showing that it prefers a different kind of pressure, one that makes Russian control more expensive, more unstable, and way more difficult to maintain until the position weakens enough from the inside. And once the bridge stops feeling permanent, the whole Russian story around Crimean Peninsula starts to shake, because the Kremlin can explain away many things, but it is much harder to explain why ordinary Russians are lining up to leave the place that was supposed to be the safest symbol of Putin's victory. Now here is where most people do not see the whole picture, because they look at Crimea and ask whether Ukraine can physically enter the peninsula tomorrow, when the better question, to be honest, is whether Russia can still keep the peninsula supplied tomorrow, next week, next month, and, well, next year and after that. Crimea is not just land on a map. It is a logistical system that depends on roads, rail, ferries, bridges, fuel deliveries, and civilian confidence. And when those systems start failing together, the map can look unchanged, while the reality on the ground becomes completely different. Civilian gasoline sales have reportedly been halted, we even spoke about this in previous videos, with fuel being solely reserved for the military and government structures. And just that one single little detail tells you almost everything about the direction of the crisis, because authorities usually do not stop ordinary people from buying fuel when the system is healthy. I mean, do they do it in America, Canada? No. They do it when supply has become too fragile to just support normal life. At the same time, Crimea is already experiencing pressure on also grocery stores, drinking water, electricity and basic services, which is especially dangerous because the peninsula does not naturally have enough fresh water to comfortably support a large modern population on its own without infrastructure working properly. Water pumps require electricity. Electricity requires functioning power systems. Repairs require fuel and parts for these systems. Fuel and parts then require safe transportation. And safe transportation requires roads, bridges, rails and ferries that Ukraine is now pressuring from multiple directions. That is what makes this entire strategy of Ukraine so powerful. Because Ukraine is not just targeting one thing and hoping everything else just collapses by accident. No, it is attacking the system that allows Russian control to feel normal. And once that normality disappears, the Kremlin must either admit that Crimea is in trouble or pretend everything is fine while civilians discover the truth on their own. The railway situation may be the most important part of all, because the Kerch Strait Bridge has already been treated by Russia as unsafe for certain types of heavy cargo, especially military and fuel shipments. And if additional rail links inside Crimea are disrupted, Russia becomes more dependent on trucks. But trucks are slower, more vulnerable, more expensive and easier to pressure, especially when they have to travel through routes Ukraine is already watching. Which means every damaged bridge, rail line and blocked ferry multiplies every other problem at the same time. This is exactly why Ukrainian pressure on electrical substations, bridges and transport nodes matters so much. Because once Crimea is already difficult to supply from the outside, anything damaged on the inside becomes harder to repair. And every delay creates more public stress, more shortages and more doubts about whether the Russian authorities even just actually have a plan. I mean, they will always tell they do, but you know what I mean. The Russian installed authorities in Crimea can tell people not to panic, tell them to trust the official sources and ask them to unplug appliances because the grid is overpowered and struggling. But the contradiction is, at this point, too obvious. Because when a government says everything is under control, while also asking people to reduce basic electricity use to unplug your toasters, people understand that something serious is happening. And this is where this story moves from logistics into political psychology. Because Crimea is supposed to be Putin's vacation symbol, a place associated with summer tourism, weddings, beaches, apartments, restaurants, and just in general, comfort, easy life, which makes shortages there much more politically painful than shortages in some distant rural region that Moscow can simply ignore. When the vacation destination turns into a place people are trying to avoid and leave, the symbol starts working against the Kremlin. The next part is absolutely crucial to understand, because the most dangerous thing for Moscow may not be the bridge, may not even be the power grid or the fuel shortage by itself, but the human movement that could follow if people in Crimea conclude that the peninsula is no longer safe. Crimea has more than 2 million people, and even if a large portion of them begins moving towards mainland Russia, the Kremlin will face something it has tried very hard to keep away from its own public, which is a visible internal displacement crisis created by the consequences of the war. That is why the 3-hour line at the Kerch Strait Bridge matters so much, because it is not just traffic, it is an early warning sign, and if the line leaving Crimea is already 3 times, once again, longer than the line entering Crimea before the shortages even reach the war stage, then the pressure could grow quickly once people realize that fuel, electricity, water and food may become even more uncertain and unaffordable. The Kremlin has a serious messaging problem here, because if it publicly admits that the situation is dangerous, it risks creating panic not only in Crimea but across Russia. And then if it refuses to admit the danger, it leaves civilians to discover the crisis, one failed service, one empty shelf, and one fuel restriction at a time. And if large numbers of Russians leave Crimea, the next question becomes where would they even go? Because they will not just disappear into empty space, into vacuum. They will move into the populated European part of Russia, towards cities, relatives, regional systems that may not be prepared for such a sudden inflow, physical people inflow, and then also inflow information, if it will happen. which is another important factor here. These people will be talking about what is happening in Crimea and how propaganda lies to them. Some could move north towards even Moscow, making the consequences of the war visible near the political heart of the country, while others could move east-south towards the Caucasus region, where Russia has already historically faced serious internal tensions and where the arrival of large number of displaced people could and most likely will create pressure in extremely sensitive areas. This is where the numbers become politically explosive, because Russia has around 140 million people, so 2 or 3, 2.5 million displaced civilians may not sound like enough to change the entire country on paper, even though it is more than 1.5%. But in real life, those people do not spread evenly across all 11 time zones. They appear in specific towns, in big cities, train stations, inside government systems. Once again, we have seen in the United States and across Europe how migration pressure can become a major political issue, even in countries not fighting a major war on their own border. So now just imagine what that pressure could look like inside Russia, where the government has spent years telling people that the war is distant, controlled, and most certainly 100% victorious. That is the danger for Putin, because the Russian public has been conditioned to accept the conflict as long as it happens somewhere else, on television and in regions far from the comfortable center of Russian life. But an internal wave of people leaving Crimea would make these consequences physical, visible, and hard to dismiss. Suddenly, the war would not just be about maps or state television graphics. It would be about families arriving with luggage, fear, and stories, most importantly stories, about shortages in the very place Russia promised would be the safest forever. And once that happens, the Kremlin loses one of its most important tools, which is the distance. Let's look at this from a different angle, because one of the biggest mistakes Western commentators made for years was assuming that if Ukraine could not take Crimea quickly and unexpectedly, surprisingly, then Ukraine could not take Crimea at all. That assumption was always too simple, because Ukraine did not need to match Russia soldier for soldier, ship for ship, or even aircraft for aircraft in order to make Crimea vulnerable. It only needed to find the pressure points that made Russian control harder to sustain than Russian propaganda could ever admit. For years, people including J.D. Vance, Donald Trump, and many others argued in different ways that Ukraine could never realistically recover Crimea. And even some people who supported Ukraine privately believed Crimea was too fortified, too symbolic, and too complicated to even seriously consider challenging. But what we are seeing right now is that Ukraine may have been approaching the problem differently from the beginning, because instead of trying to immediately just storm a movie-style, heavily defended peninsula, the beaches, Ukraine has been patiently weakening the systems that allow Russia to remain there comfortably in the first place. This is the same broader logic Ukraine has used across the entire war. Pressure logistics, exhaust resources, force Russia to spend more than it can afford, and slowly turn the occupation from an asset into a burden. That does not mean that the process is easy, fast, or guaranteed by any means, but it does mean the old assumption that Crimea is automatically impossible to recover no longer looks as strong as it once did. If Russia cannot reliably bring fuel in, cannot safely move heavy cargo by rail, cannot guarantee electricity, cannot keep civilians calm, and cannot convince people that the Kerch Strait Bridge is secure, then the peninsula starts becoming less like an untouchable fortress and more like an isolated liability. This is also why Ukraine's use of drones, long-range pressure, and modern targeting has changed the battlefield, because the old way of thinking said a country needed massive naval and air superiority to threaten a place like Crimea, while the new reality shows that intelligence, precision systems, and patience can make even heavily defended territory feel exposed. Russia built its strategy around size, intimidation, and the belief that the world would eventually accept its control over occupied territory, while Ukraine built its strategy around adaptation, pressure, and understanding that Russia's biggest symbols could become Russia's biggest weaknesses. And that is exactly what we are seeing with Crimea right now, because the Kremlin does not just have to defend land, it has to defend an entire political myth. And political myths, as you might know, are much harder to maintain when people are lining up to leave. There is a twist to this that most people will miss, because as Crimea becomes more difficult to supply, Russia will almost certainly try to turn the story around and accuse Ukraine of targeting civilians, creating hardships, and acting aggressively against us ordinary people. As you can imagine, that narrative is extremely predictable, surprised it did not happen yet, because the basic reality is that Russia created this situation by occupying Ukrainian territory, militarizing the peninsula, and then expecting Ukraine to treat that occupation as permanent. Crimea is still and most likely will always remain internationally recognized as Ukrainian territory, and many Russian civilians living there arrived after Russia took control in 2014, often occupying property and economic space that belonged to Ukrainians, who left because they did not want to live under Russian rule. So when Ukraine pressures Russians to leave Crimea, it is not the same as randomly targeting civilians in a normal, distant Russian city. It is more like forcing an illegal occupation to become unsustainable while still leaving people a route, a chance to go out. And that small distinction matters a lot, because Ukraine has not closed the exit once again. In fact, the continued existence of the Kerch Strait Bridge may be useful precisely because it gives civilians a way to live, while Ukraine focuses on stopping military supplies, fuel and logistical support from making the occupation stronger. This is why the timing around the bridge is so interesting, because if Ukraine wanted to create maximum chaos without regard for civilian movement, it could just try to remove the exit immediately, just destroy the bridge. But instead, the bridge remains open while pressure increases, which suggests that the current strategy may be to make the message impossible to ignore, leave while the road is still there, and just go. Simple as that. Russian propaganda will obviously not explain it that way, because Moscow needs to portray itself as the protector of Crimea and Ukraine as the source of every hardship, but that is exactly why the details matter. Russia entered Ukrainian territory, turned Crimea into a military platform, told its people everything was secure, and now faces the possibility that the same civilians it encouraged to settle may start fleeing back into Russia in huge numbers. That is not a Ukrainian propaganda problem, that is a fact now. That is a Kremlin credibility problem. And the more Russia pretends everything is normal, the more dramatic the contrast becomes when the people on the ground cannot buy gasoline, cannot rely on stable electricity, and cannot understand why the bridge that was supposed to symbolize permanent connection now feels like the very last practical exit. So, what does this all really mean? It means Crimea may be entering one of the most important phases of the entire war, because Ukraine is no longer just talking about future liberation in symbolic language, it is applying practical pressure to the roads, bridges, fuel systems, electrical infrastructure, and political assumptions that allow Russia to hold the peninsula. It means the Kerch Strait Bridge is becoming more than just a target, because it is now a message, a warning, and a test of whether Russian civilians still believe Moscow can protect what is claimed to have secured forever. And most importantly, it means Putin's greatest trophy may be turning into one of his greatest liabilities. Because if 2 million or even 2.5 million people begin leaving Crimea, Russia will not just be dealing with a military problem. It will be dealing with a visible domestic crisis that brings the consequences of the war directly into Russian cities, politics and society. So guys, if you want to follow what happens next to the peninsula and everything, please make sure to subscribe to our channel, like this video. Thanks so much Ground News for sponsoring this video. The links are down below. See you on Monday.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway.